Hello everyone, welcome back to another Pokemon Bible study and movie review in Shady Oak Ministries. I'm of course Shady Oak, and today we're going to be discussing the 18th movie in the Pokemon franchise, the movie Hoopa and the Clash of Ages. Now, this movie was definitely one very well looked forward to among the fan base, considering all of the legendary cameos and demonstrations of power that were seen therein. Definitely a very high-octane monster mash, if you will, that any Pokemon fan would appreciate, especially once they got to the latter portions of the Pokemon game where all you were doing were just showing off your legendaries to a bunch of poor innocent kids who all they had at their disposal were Wurmples and Burmies and all the other pitiful excuses. And then you moved on to Pokemon Showdown and realized when people can utilize the system, it stinks. But the point that we're going to be discussing here today is actually not necessarily the overwhelming power demonstrated in the legendaries, but rather, and most importantly, the lessons that we could actually learn from Hoopa and the differences that we see regarding his fallen nature in the differentiation between his unbound and bound form, the merits therein, and of course how we ourselves will one day be rid of our unbound forms as well. I'd like to start in the book of James chapter 1 and verse 15, where, and I couldn't stress this enough, we will always be coming back to regarding our struggle against sin, because the battle won't end until we see the Lord face to face. We'll come back to that in a minute. But while the battle is still ongoing, understand the enemy is not one to be negotiated with. James 1:15, when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. This will always be the case. This is the nature of sin and death itself, and it will never be negotiated with. Once sin has fully grown, it will only produce one thing in your life, and that is death. Now, we are sinners and will never be perfect until we see the Lord face to face. I emphasize this point again and again. And the ideal of the Christian life is to love Jesus more than anything else that sin has to offer. To enjoy Jesus so much that any alternative has no room to even become a thought. That's the point and principle. That's how Christians overcome sin. Not by hating sin, but loving God so much that they don't want anything to do with sin. Because if you get rid of evil in your life, you are left with a void. You're not naturally filled with something else. You need to choose to replace sin with something that satisfies you more. And you can only learn to love Jesus more than sin if you actually understand what it means to enjoy Jesus. Now, this is the ideal. Romans 16:19. For your obedience has become known to all, therefore I am glad on your behalf, but I want you to be, now note this is Paul's further recommendation, wise in what is good and simple, for all intents and purposes, stupid concerning evil. We are encouraged to be ignorant of the things of darkness. We don't want to study our enemies so that we could have a proper understanding of the things we need to avoid. That never ends well, trust me. Well, all these things then being pointed out, then understand that it always comes back to the same thing, that sin is only going to bring one thing, even if it advertises something different. We recall in the flashbacks at the beginning of the film that Hoopa was only one thing. He was dangerous and he was evil. Note, it didn't appear so at first. When sin was conceived, it was kind of cute. It even gave us some benefits. When it was welcomed, and even worse, fed by the people of Archie Valley, what did it seem to bring them? It brought them wealth and it brought them health. But in the end, what was the only thing that it produced? It was, in order to show off its strength, bring only destruction and pain. So what was used to confront it? Well, the priest of Arceus, no shortage of hints to the Hebrew high priest there, bound his power, but allowed Hoopa himself to stay. Why? It was under the condition that he would understand that its power, just like all of ours, had a purpose beyond serving itself and hurting others in the process. Now this is where we get into Proverbs 14 and verse 12. We've mentioned this a number of times. It says, there is a way that seems right to a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. That's why it begins with the desire and it ends with death, because sin is always the result of a fallen, sinful heart and perspective. It goes along the lines of the same famous saying that the path to hell is paved with good intentions. And I myself have to admit that my worst mistakes are always made when I mean well and think that I'll be able to handle the sin that used to hurt me in the past, that I could bring the things back into my life that were once a stumbling block and an obstacle regarding my relationship and walk with Jesus. Now, again, we see this illustrated when Hoopa had gained a heart, had become an entirely different person, and had even grown in understanding its relationship with the family of others, with the brother and sister, Mire and her brother, and all of the other people, and getting to enjoy Ashkan and all that kind of stuff. What happened the moment the bottle returned to him? I mean, no uncertain terms. You touch something, you get red glowing eyes, and it zombify possesses you so that you have to go and bring it to Hoopa so that it wants to dominate and take over and possess him again. Why was Hoopa so afraid? Because I was losing myself. I was disappearing. I don't want to disappear. Why? Because the moment it was released, what did unbound Hoopa do? It continued exactly where it left off the moment it was bound. It didn't change its nature. The thief does not come except to steal, to kill, and to destroy. It will continue to do so. That's the nature and default of the enemy. John 10, chapter 10. Now, this then begs the question, was Mire then wrong in wanting to give Hoopa his power back for his betterment? No. The problem was she assumed that giving Hoopa that power back would be for his betterment. Understand the difference. That in Proverbs chapter 11 verse 21, it's always the default policy of evil. That only by deception is it going to be able to make any sort of case. But you also need to understand that it's always going to try to gather the greater crowd. We've seen it in all the Marvel and DC movies that evil always has to over-dominate and over-demonstrate its powers and capabilities in order to make any sort of semblance to the light and making it think that it doesn't have any other chance. Hoopa brought more legendaries and said, see, I'm greater than you. I have more on my side. But here's the problem. Proverbs 11:21, just like evil does not change, good's nature doesn't change either. Though the wicked join forces, they will not go unpunished, but the posterity of the righteous shall be delivered. Now, the response and explanation to this is really simple. Whenever evil tries to overcome or outnumber you, you need to understand that by overcoming evil and darkness and sin in our lives, it's the same poor response to try and match unbound Hoopa by just bringing in more legendaries. That just made the whole situation worse, right? Even if you did have Rayquaza on your side, it would just make a bigger mess. That's why Romans 12:21 says, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Now, where do we see this? When Hoopa's unbound power was destroyed, was it by having more legendaries and matching them blow for blow? No, it was understanding that they were fighting on the wrong battlefield, that Ash had to remind Hoopa that instead of fighting it in the same way of mind control, possession, dominance, legendaries, and pardon the expression, but jumping through more hoops than the other person, what was it? Instead of fighting like the legendaries, fighting like Arceus, with forgiveness and mercy, coming to terms with the fact that yes, you're here and I'm sorry all these things had to happen, but you need to understand that you were hurting people. Will you let me forgive you? That is how you overcome darkness with light. That is how you extinguish fire with water. That is how you create hope for the future, not with explosions, but by just laying down new soil. And that's the point that's being made here. You need to understand that, well, you're probably asking, I thought Hoopa was a type of sin and that it will always be a part of our lives until we see the Lord. How could he come to terms with his sin? Are you given this like sort of Eastern idea where it's just like, oh, if you just understand that if you're all just inherently good and if you can make peace with evil, then it will always be all right. I mentioned at the beginning, you can't negotiate with evil. You can only eliminate it. You can only take its power away. The only that will be made one and actually perfected in the image of God like we were intended to be is when we see the Lord face to face. But wait, when did Hoopa come to terms with his unbound power? When was Hoopa able to overcome his flesh, quote unquote, or his sinful nature? Who was there at that time for everyone to see? Arceus showed up. They saw the Lord face to face. And understand, that's the same day when we will be free from sin's power. But understand, until that day, remember how to fight these battles properly. Not with more legendaries, more power, more strength. I'll be better than my sin. You won't. Size differences as a start of possibilities. Bound Hoopa, unbound Hoopa. Big differences. But also understand that if you fight with the right tools, forgiveness and mercy, that's all we've been given to combat our flesh. And understand as well, it's all we'll ever need. Thank you for your time and listening to this study. I hope it's been a blessing to you. If you have any questions or would like to know more about the topics discussed, leave them in the comments below. Sincerity will always be matched with clarity. If you'd like to encourage the ministry, you know where to go. But most importantly, if you know someone who perhaps is familiar with this film but not these principles, who is struggling with sin and doesn't know how to deal with it, or perhaps is just looking for an opportunity to get a greater appreciation for these things and have the chance to go back into God's Word, please share this study with anyone and everyone you feel would be blessed by it. Thank you for your time in listening to this study, and once again, remember, Jesus loves you, has a plan for your life, and has given you all you need to continue fighting until the day when you see Him face to face and know what it's like to truly enjoy life.